I'm Richard France. I'm with Estolano LeSar Advisors, and welcome to our panel on transit and smart growth. So I'm going to kick things off and do a little bit of, I'm going to introduce our panel first, do a round of introductions, then do a little bit of framing, and then I'm going to turn it over to our esteemed panel here to kind of go through and give their spiel on what they do best. And then we'll do a little bit of a guided discussion, and then open it up to the audience for questions. So, sound good? Perfect. All righty. So, first, I want to introduce Alana Dave. Alana works for the International Transportation Workers Federation. The ITF is a global union federation representing all transport sectors, including road, rail, maritime, and aviation. Currently, there are over 650 transport unions affiliated from around the world. Alana leads ITF's global program on public transport, and for many years, she was ITF's education officer. So join me in welcoming Alana. All right, moving on down the line, Rusty Hicks. Rusty is the president of the Los Angeles County Federation of Labor, AFL-CIO. He is one of the youngest and the first post-war 9/11 war veteran to lead one of the nation's largest labor federations. Raised by a single mother in Fort Worth, Texas, Rusty saw firsthand the challenges of attaining the American dream. Her hard work inspired him to a life of service. He's a lieutenant in the United States Navy Reserve and a veteran of the war in Afghanistan. Rusty is a member of the Los Angeles College Faculty Guild, American Federation of Teachers Local 1521. Join me in welcoming Rusty. And last but certainly not least, Yvonne Williams. Yvonne began her career in transportation in January 1980 as an interstate transit operator for Greyhound Lines Bus Company. And that is when she first became a member of ATU Local 1225. In 1986, Yvonne joined ATU 192 as a transit operator, and in 1999, the members of ATU 192 elected her as their shop steward. After serving 6 years as shop steward, she was elected president of ATU Local 192, and where she is currently in her fourth three-year term in office, representing members from AC Transit, National Express, and A Paratransit. As president, Yvonne is the chief executive officer of ATU 192 and is responsible for the daily operations of the union. So, join me in welcoming Yvonne. All right, so what are we talking about? So this panel is really focusing on labor's evolving role in the sustainable transportation movement. We're gonna be looking at kind of best practices in building coalitions, engaging workers, and supporting policies that support clean transportation options. So basically, what we can do to reduce single occupant vehicle trips. So we'll really discuss how these policies can help move us towards climate goals and also support the creation of good, family supportive jobs, and also bring in communities that have historically not been represented in our larger conversations about investments and kind of moving forward on the sustainability track. So Alana's gonna kick it off for us and bring a global perspective to this, talking about best practices and how coalition building throughout the world has led to more sustainable transportation investments. So I'll turn it over to you, Alana.
Thank you, Richard. Sorry, is this working? No. That's better. Okay, so I'm going to be speaking about a global program on public transport that I coordinate. And actually, just in these 5 minutes, I'm going to talk a little bit about the perspective and strategy that we've developed, and then later talk about some of the best practices and coalition building. When we started this program, we made a decision that we need to build the industrial and political power of public transport trade unions simultaneously. And I think this is really important for me to emphasize because it gives you some insight into what we mean by just transition in public transport. And we've taken a very conscious decision to not only narrowly focus on employment issues, such as job creation, skills, retraining, These are absolutely fundamental issues. They're core labor issues. But we feel the climate crisis provides us, as an international labor movement, with an opportunity to have a much more transformational labor agenda related to the model and kind of public transport that we want. Now, I think it's really interesting talking about just transition issues in public transport, because often the assumption is that there are no just transition issues. This is a green sector. There are obvious opportunities for job creation, that really it's just about investment and expanding public transport. And to be really honest with you, this has not been our experience internationally. There are winners and losers in public transport. With privatization over the last few decades, the current model of public transport in both developing countries as well as industrialized countries are not delivering the social, employment, or environmental benefits. So there are massive just transition issues in public transport. We have experienced job losses in relation to when there's a transition from informal to formal public transport, as well as new urban transport systems creating jobs, but jobs that are non-union jobs and with anti-union employers. So we feel this is a time when really as a labor movement in public transport, we need a much more holistic strategy, addressing workplace issues, which are absolutely bread and butter issues for our members, but linking these issues to the much bigger questions of who owns, controls, organizes, and finances public transport. So in this program, what we are trying to do, and I know this sounds very ambitious, but we feel this is what the climate crisis demands, is positioning unions politically to fight for a different public transport system. A public transport system that meets the needs of the majority of people and workers and not the profit-making interests of private companies. In other words, we're at a moment where we're really needing to look at how do we shift the balance of power in the public transport sector in favor of unions, in favor of workers, as well as communities. So what we are looking at is how do we become, as public transport trade unions globally, the voice for a bold and different vision of public transport? How do we revive and reclaim the meaning of public so that public is not just about the service offered to the public, but also about public values and principles with a pro-public agenda? And that is why we have called the program that we are leading and coordinating Our Public Transport. And the definition and the narrative related to our is inclusive and about being pro-public. So in all our messaging, we are talking about our as being the millions of workers who rely on public transport for employment, as well as the millions of ordinary people who rely on public transport to move around cities. But in our work globally, we are also talking about the millions of informal workers who rely on providing public transport for their livelihoods, as well as the millions of ordinary people who still do not have access to public transport. And we feel that this definition of our, challenges the current model that most of us are familiar with in public transport as being the solution to the crisis. And what do I mean by crisis? And I just want to point to three aspects of it. The one is, all of us would probably know that public transport in most cities around the world is not expanding fast enough to meet the needs of cities. In fact, in many cities around the world, the majority of public transport services are still informal. In some developing cities, this is about 85% of the public transport provision. We also know that public transport is not expanding fast enough to cut emissions. Emissions from transport are increasing faster than any other sector. We know in the United States that transport is now the leading source of CO2 emissions. Even an institution like the World Bank is saying that the world is off track to achieve sustainable mobility. And the third dimension of the crisis is that we've seen workers' terms and conditions of employment in public transport decline. Employment has become more insecure. There's more competition between public and private companies, causing a race to the bottom. And millions of workers internationally are still in informal employment. But the big challenge for us as the labor movement is we know the current model is not the solution to the crisis and is also part of the cause of the environmental crisis. If we do not organize, if we do not lay the groundwork for the alternative, then the need to expand and invest in public transport will become another market opportunity for private companies. And we have already seen this happening in many countries around the world, often with money that is coming from climate financing of institutions like the United Nations. So what we've seen in our work and what we've heard from many of our affiliated unions is that new urban transport systems are being developed, but which often do not result in the wider social benefits for workers and communities. And the simple explanation for this is that these models are based on a profit-driven approach, many of them based on public-private partnerships. So that is why it's so important that we intervene locally and internationally, and that's what we're doing through our program. So we are raising awareness of workers of these new urban transport systems, formulating trade union demands, developing alternative policies, which I'll look at later, as well as then campaigning both at a mass-based level, but also in relation to some of the key decision makers in cities, but also internationally. Thanks.
Thank you, Alana. And now we're going to turn it over to Rusty to take it down to LA with a discussion that Cecilia kind of previewed at this morning's panel, but to go a little bit more in depth in kind of the coalition between business, enviros, and labor that helped push Measure JJJ in Los Angeles over the finish line. So turn it over to you, Rusty.
Well, first of all, thank you for the opportunity to come and talk about what's happening and has happened in Los Angeles. I thought you were going to let me off the hook and I could just say what Cecilia said this morning and then hand the mic over to somebody else. But it'll take me about 35 minutes to get through my full download of what's going down. So I know our timekeeper is going to probably lose her mind here in just a couple moments. But I think a couple key highlights, and then certainly want to open it up to more of a discussion. I do think that, you know, obviously Los Angeles has a history of the car culture. And I think over the past decade or so, you have seen Los Angeles begin to come around to the concept of public transportation that actually works for people, that is reliable, that is affordable, and ultimately saves them time and money of not having to be on the road. And so in 2008, 2012, and 2016, you actually saw a pretty unprecedented coalition come together to tax ourselves, to put significant resources into building out a transit system across the county of Los Angeles. Was successful in 2008 for about $40 billion, and then in 2016 was successful at about $140 billion, creating about 465,000 jobs over the lifetime of that measure. So that's really the context for the measure that we're going to talk about, Proposition JJJ. It was the first time where you actually connected transit with housing, with jobs. But I think it's important to remember that it was started through Measure R, through Measure J, through Measure M, that it essentially built out and prepared to build out, funded the build out of the backbone of the County of Los Angeles and gave us opportunities to build upon that. The conversation around housing for us really started around a conversation around the minimum wage. 2015, that was the debate going on in the city of LA and then the county, and ultimately in 2016 in the state. But we knew through that political bargaining process that any wage increase we actually were able to get for workers would ultimately be eaten up very quickly through an increase in rents. And at the same time, we also had that really a community revolt against all of the luxury housing that was being built all across the city of Los Angeles. And so as a result, there was a ballot measure that came forward which essentially put a 2-year moratorium on all construction of housing in the city of Los Angeles. Obviously, that's problematic for a number of reasons, and we sought to actually partner with the business community to push back on that. But my question was, well, we can't be a coalition of no. What do we actually stand for? What exactly are we going to put forward? It was very interesting that the development community essentially just patted me on the shoulder and said, well, let's defeat this first, and then we'll talk about that. And I didn't quite think that was the right response. And so I partnered with bringing in our building and construction trades and our housing community and coalition to say, well, how do we bring together housing and jobs? How do we ensure that we get more affordable housing? And how do we ensure that we put good jobs into an industry that has historically, the residential construction industry, that has historically not provided good quality jobs? And so JJJ, which was developed over the Christmas of 2015 and went to the street at the beginning of 2016, really was the result. And essentially it said that if a developer goes to the city and wants a general plan amendment, wants a zoning change, that will ultimately increase the value of that parcel of land. We, the community, should get something for it. There should be a dividend that we as the community get as a result of that. And so we're going to require something of you in exchange for that zoning change and that zoning planning change. One is you got to include affordable housing. It was up to 20% of the project had to be for low and extremely low income housing, or up to 40% for moderate income housing. And 60% of the workers had to be trained through a state-approved labor management apprenticeship program. And 30% of the workers had to be from the local community within, I believe it was 2 miles of that particular site. And the third piece of that was we allowed for an overlay around the transit system, which essentially took all the zoning density requirements, took the cap off. So essentially within a 1/4 mile of that transit hub, which was passed by Measure R, J, and M, we allowed you to essentially build as much as you could fit on that particular parcel of land, including the affordable housing requirements, giving jobs to local workers. It is not, the idea was to say yes to density in the right places, to not say that we're going to create a Manhattan out of Los Angeles, but there are particular areas and there are particular places where density certainly makes sense. So this was, I think, one of the first time where we were able to combine transit with affordable housing with good quality jobs, and we hope that there will be more of it. So I look forward to talking more about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Rusty. And now Yvonne, showing us all up with handouts and whatnot, will be discussing the transit union's role in pushing for sustainable public transit in the future. So turn it over to you, Yvonne.
Okay, thank you. And there are some handouts that I've handed out, and I will be asking you to refer to a couple of them as we go along. If you didn't get a handout, then Jermaine will certainly hand you one. So I want to, of course, say good afternoon to our moderator, Richard, and to the co-panelists, Laura and Rusty. So we're working with the ITF on reducing the climate disruption and expand public transit. We hosted the Labor Network for Sustainability annual meeting at our national headquarters in DC, and I was one of the panelists there. A couple of the slides that I'll be using today for this event will kind of highlight the difference between automation, mass transportation, and TNCs, transportation network companies. So if you look at slide number 1, we're going to talk about, it's a simple slide, ride-hailing services such as Uber and Lyft. They're not doing their part to prevent climate disruption, pollution and traffic congestion, or to prevent economic and social injustices and equality. So as you can see, if you look at the slide, very easy to see. If you look at a single car, then the CO2s from a single car is 3,600 grams. And then I don't have to read the rest of the slide because you can look at it and it's self-evident that public transportation is the most efficient way in order to move the public from one point to another. The single occupancy vehicles create many times more greenhouse gas emissions per person than public transit. In the Bay Area and elsewhere, traffic congestion has worsened because of massive upsurge in ride-hailing vehicles, and here's why. Slide 2, space required to transport 60 persons. If you look at that on slide 2, it's a simple demonstration, but the demonstration is clear and it shows that if you transport 60 people by bus, or bike, or car, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to see that the most efficient way to transport the public is by public bus and public transportation. And so moving on, and the difference that it makes in a car, urban or autonomous vehicle, it really doesn't matter much because in order to transport 60 people or however many people you want to transport efficiently, you need to transport them by bus. Slide 3, and the space requires to transport 60 people by car, Uber, or autonomous cars. And from the labor's rights perspective, the economic injustice that it does to our workers, our workforce that are transporting by Uber and Lyft is unexcusable. Why? Because from a labor's perspective, they're being treated as independent contractors. They're being exploited economically. They're being exploited because they don't have the same benefits that you have when you're a public transit worker that's unionized. Those benefits cover your family with your health and welfare coverage. Those benefits cover some type of retirement. Many other retirement systems that unionized workers have are still covered under a pension plan, which is unheard of. So basically, they're putting the onus of these workers who work, and I'm not talking about the workers when I say Uber and Lyft, and they're a problem. I'm talking about the Uber and Lyft corporations and companies that are exploiting workers. So that's our perspective on that. Especially as more and more transit gets electrified, it doesn't make sense to have many people driving around looking for the next fare. The answer to get more people out of cars and into public transit is to make sure that public transit is affordable, available, and easily accessed. Many socioeconomic and environmental benefits to public transit needs to expand it. So the big part of smart growth is having more transit that goes to places where people actually live. What I found in my research is that it's a self-destructive condition of transit to say that transit is not being utilized by the public, and therefore transit in those areas should be reduced or eliminated. We found in situations where you do actually provide transit, it's accessible and easily, and that it's convenient for people to ride, that they actually will choose to ride public transportation. So when public transportation is reduced, taken out of the communities, and then transit is only relegated to main lines or thoroughfares, then the people on the artilleries that run for transit, that support transit or feed transit, they can't get to transit. And so therefore they get into their cars. And so that analogy would be to say that if you have those roller seats that you're sitting in, and then you have the staircase there. So you have buses running up and down the rows of the seats, but then there's no staircase, so there's no way to get to the seats and to the transit. So that's an analogy of what I'm saying when I'm talking about when you reduce the availability of transit into the communities, and then you only run transit on the main thoroughfares, as in these seats, then the people who really prefer to use a transit and would want to use a transit can't get to the transit to use it. So then they take Uber or Lyft or their cars, or even worse, they're not able to leave their homes, they become shut-ins, they're not able to go to social services, they're not able to go to any of the enjoyments of life. So that's what happens when you take the attitude that because people are not on these particular lines in mass numbers, that the lines should be cut. So the truth about job creation. Transit creates more jobs per million than other green economy sectors. As the IFT, Alana acknowledges and has a point, if public transit systems double in size, GHG emissions per capita would decrease by 60%. So investing in transit is investing in economic justice, climate justice, and smart growth. And that's a quote from Alana. So here's a motto we should remember. Here's a motto that we should remember. Save the bus, ride a bus, and save our planet. So our vision for sustainable transportation, how do we get there? What is labor's role in fulfilling this vision? We will talk about that as we continue on our panel discussions. Okay, so we'll be talking about the vision later. So that's it, thank you. Excellent.
Thank you, Yvonne. All right, so I think you all actually covered what is your vision for sustainable transportation future pretty well in your presentations. But I kind of want to drill down and talk a little bit more, and I'd like you each to respond. As we look at the future of transportation in your eyes, what kind of physical changes do we need to see in our infrastructure and the way that we allocate and prioritize space? And then I think on the other side of that, what are the social and economic benefits that actually need to accrue to people as we think about our sustainable transportation future?
Well, since I'm holding the mic, I guess I'll go first. Well, I think the example in Los Angeles is we just actually need to do it. I think to the point that a transit system doesn't work if it's not accessible to those who would use it. I think Los Angeles is a perfect example of that, because there has been comments that ridership is low, or not enough folks are using transit, and it's because it's not accessible to those communities that actually need them. In the conversation that led to these ballot measures that ultimately will fund a transit system in LA, there was a big debate around where you should start. And there were many communities in the outer portions of the county that were on the later end of the development cycle that were unhappy. You know, why am I being taxed for 20 years before I'm ever going to see an impact of the measure? And it really, you know, you have to build out from what infrastructure you actually have in order to make it connected. But ultimately, I would just say in Los Angeles, it just has to happen, and it has to happen faster. The second I would say is what benefit should come to the community. I mean, one of the biggest parts of the measure took place in 2007 and at the beginning of 2008, and that was the establishment of what was called the construction careers policy that essentially put a project labor agreement in place on any project. I think it was over $1 million within the MTA, within Metro. And therefore, it covered any and all dollars that flowed into that agency and out of that agency, whether they were construction jobs, maintenance jobs, operations jobs. There were going to be quality jobs connected to that with a local hire component. And so I think not only it has to be built and has to be built faster, but second, those policies to ensure that there are good quality jobs connected to that are really critical.
Okay, thank you for asking that question. But before we talk about vision, I really want to talk about what the problem is. And the problem is social and economic injustices and how people in disadvantaged communities, if they want to tell, but people in the community I came from, people in the community I still serve, people that transportation operators serve every day, because we do not drive over the communities as in rail. We do not go around the communities as in water. We go through the communities. We go through the communities where your children are. We go through the communities where the elderly are. We go through the communities where the social services are. We go through the communities where the schools are located. And the transportation needs of that community. And as far as if you want to talk about climate, injustice and how that affects our communities, in our communities, we will be the first ones to lose our jobs when it comes to climate injustice. In our communities, we will be the first ones that will be affected by the adverse changes in the weather and the climate. In Oakland, California, not far from here, in the flatlands of Oakland, California, it's already been determined, should it be a climate disruption of a major proportion, our communities will be the first ones that will be displaced because we are on the flat lands. We are not in the hills. We will be driven out of our communities. And so, I want to talk about that before I get into, what transit should be doing or what I think policies should be changed to better serve transit. So, the short and long of the whole story is, how do climate changes really affect people? So what policies should be in place? Policies should be in place to make sure that if there is a major event, that there will be transportation for people to move from those communities. That transportation is 100% a bus. If you look at all the disasters that have happened around, to move mass people in an expedient way, the best way to do it is public transportation, and it's a bus. And so there should be policies in place to make sure that public transportation is funded, to make sure that public transportation is readily available in a crisis. We have a crisis looming now where in February of 2019, BART will be shut down for a significant number of hours starting in the early morning. It's about an hour and a half in the early morning. Ground transportation is going to be the one to come in there and build that bus bridge from the outlined areas in suburbia to make sure that people can get to work and there isn't a catastrophe that develops in the Bay Area. So we need funding, we need education, and we need for our legislators to take it seriously when the union and when the managers go to the legislators and say, look, this is why public transit is important, and this is why public transit must be funded. So those are the policies we think that should be in place. Those are the policies that we advocate for on a daily basis, and those are the policies we think that the public needs to get behind in order to make sure that public transportation stays public.
So not to repeat what's already been said, but looking a bit forward, I think it's also important for us to have ideas about sort of the model of ownership of public transport and how that model empowers us as workers and citizens. And if we're saying some of the debates we've had, if public ownership is the model of ownership that empowers us as workers and citizens, we need to make sure that there are mechanisms in place that give us real power. So what are our ideas as a labor movement about how public transport is accountable to citizens? What are the mechanisms for their participation and control over that system? And how are workers empowered? So how are workers and citizens involved in decision making about the transportation system? So I think those are some of the bigger issues that we need to be thinking about. And I think, well, what we've tried to do in the global program, what's really important is for us as trade unions to begin developing that alternative policy so that we're not only reacting to what is wrong currently in mass transit, but we actually have our own policies in place on some of the fundamental issues of financing of public transport, ownership, employment, the use of technology in public transport, gender equity in public transport, so that we are able to articulate a different vision to the current model of public transit.
Great. All right, I want to bring this conversation, because we've been talking a lot about moving people. I want to talk about where we're moving them to and from. So bring this back and tie it into land use a little bit. And so, Rusty, this is really your question. But, you know, the state of California has been very keen on kind of following a model similar to LA's, where we focus development and density around transit hubs, and in particular affordable housing development, because that's who's riding transit, right? And yet we saw State Bill SB 827 fail spectacularly. And it was very much along the same lines as Proposition JJJ. So what made that different in LA, and why was that successful where the statewide effort failed?
I would argue there are probably two primary reasons. One is a local effort versus a statewide effort. I think California is obviously a massive place, and you try to put in one policy statewide, it becomes extremely complicated to do that, just because of the regional differences that you see, and doesn't allow for regionalization or modification based upon a particular region's circumstances. The second I think is particularly important, is we moved this policy forward through a ballot measure, not through the legislative process. And therefore, we were able to pick our moment to define the campaign on our terms, and did not get picked apart or watered down through a legislative process. I mean, in many ways, trying to run a complicated policy through a legislative body, whether it's the Assembly, the Senate, or a city council, you know, it's kind of like trying to like knit a sweater while running through a forest. Because you're trying to put this thing together, and every twig and branch and person along the way is able to pull one thread. And it makes it very hard to actually put something together that you actually want to wear. If you go to the ballot, you get to choose when you run, how you run, what you wear, and you're able to define the battle space, if you will, in a much different way. The third thing I would say is that the legislation did not necessarily put jobs at the center or a core part of that policy. It was a land use, housing policy piece of legislation, and I can certainly understand why the Senator Wiener moved forward in that direction, and my hat's off to him for putting it out there, and hopefully something comes back in sessions coming forward. But I do think a local versus a statewide effort is clearly a defining point. And second is ballot versus a legislative process. I think it's important to note that there was a lot of folks on both sides of the legislative solution that came forward, and there were certainly both sides on the ballot measure side that we had. But I think it's important to note that we did not have one elected official support us with this ballot measure. I had 3 offer to support, and they wanted to support. And I simply said, we're good. We're going to pass this without legislative bodies, without political support, and we're going to do it with a grassroots coalition-style campaign. And I think I acknowledge that the work that's been done in Los Angeles may be different than what it is in other parts of the country. And so there is some political power that has been built up over the past 20 or 30 years, and we are benefiting from that. But I think it was important for us to embrace our own power to pass a complicated policy without being at the mercy of a legislative body. So.
Great. And that's a good segue to talk about coalitions and messaging. And so, as we're looking at this from a labor perspective, right, what kind of coalitions need to be built? What kind of allies does the labor movement need to cultivate to kind of recognize this vision for public transit? Public transit centered on the workers, centered on community. Yvonne, if you want to take that away, and Alana maybe follow up.
There's no stronger alliances that you could have than with the people you serve. And in public transit, we serve people. So we have built coalitions with groups ACE, for one. We've built coalitions with Transform. We've built coalitions with several other advocacy groups that are in the Bay Area that we work closely with. And the way it's not rocket science necessarily needed to explain or to even share with you how important it is to build these alliances with your local church, your community centers, your schools, and other organizations. We, at ATU Local 192 and at the International as well, are cultivating those relationships. And the way we cultivate those relationships is by finding common ground. We don't just go to our community partners and say, we need you to support us with X, Y, and Z. We go to our community partners and say, what do we have in common that we both want to make sure we are successful at achieving? And by doing so, it has made a huge difference in passing Measure B, passing Measure C1, which are transportation measures that are funding for Alameda County and for the 9 Bay Area Alameda counties, and making sure that when we work together to build a coalition, and we take that message that is a unified message to the group that needs to hear it the most. That could be the Transportation Commission, that could be the Board of AC Transit, the Board of BART, or that could be any other group of people who really need to hear our message, churches, schools, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's how we do it, and it is very worthwhile, it's rewarding, and it's successful, and it's sustainable, because these relationships, the natural, organic gel that's there, that glues us together as a community, and that helps push our agenda forward, is something that it's more powerful than, as you said, any legislation that you could push, and it's more rewarding than any self-interest type of agenda that an individual may want to push or have. So I really appreciate the coalitions that we built and being with you guys at all times. Thank you.
Yeah, so I just want to reflect a little bit on international coalitions. And we've probably got more questions than answers at the moment because this is a kind of space that has just opened up more recently. But these are coalitions not necessarily based on a common set of interests for Labour, but a kind of necessary space for us to be operating in. And I just want to reflect on a few, and one that links to an announcement that we're going to make tomorrow at GCAS. So the one is, coming out of all the global climate change talks is an international UN initiative called Sustainable Mobility for All. And that initiative is recently an initiative that we have joined after quite a lot of debate in our organization, because it brings together all the major players in transport. So you've got all the development banks, you've got major employers organizations, you've got NGOs. But up until when we joined, there was absolutely no representation of Labour. Now, the common commitment of that group is working towards a model of sustainable transport, even though the vision is different. But it is a different kind of coalition. So the big challenge for us as a global Labour organization in transport is how do we bring employment issues, a Labour perspective to the policy making and decision making of a coalition like that. Now, we're under no illusions that any kind of good argument or good policy that we bring to the table will make any difference unless we have a public transport movement, unions mobilizing, campaigning behind us. So it's actually that organizing and campaigning strength that will give us a very different voice in those coalitions. So that's kind of one example. Another is the C40 cities, which Samantha from the Just Transition mentioned earlier. So tomorrow we're making an announcement where we are supporting a declaration that they've got on green and healthy streets. At the moment, that has been signed by about 14 cities, including some cities here in the United States. And we are expressing our intention as a global Labour movement and sort of indicating our willingness to work with mayors and other stakeholders in local economies to implement that declaration, but with a process of just transition and just transition policies, because at the moment that is completely absent from those commitments. So again, a different kind of coalition with different players, but with a common interest in creating zero-emission cities and public transport being an absolutely integral part of that. And the third one, just very quickly, we've got an international relationship with the UITP. The UITP is the international umbrella body of public transport employers, both public and private. And we've developed an international agreement with them on climate leadership. So the common interest there is that we are both organizations wanting to promote a positive message about public transport. But we are a Labour organization, they are an employers organization, but there's a coalition of interests around promoting public transport. And our challenge, and depending on our strength, is to promote a vision of public transport that encompasses many of the issues that we've been talking about today around decent work, labour standards, as well as worker and community participation in the planning and design of public transport. So just to give you a sense of some of the kind of more complex coalition issues that we're being confronted with at the moment.
All right, and this is the last question from me before we move on to audience questions. So for the entire panel, let's talk about the one policy Labour should be pursuing to kind of recognize this vision. But let's talk about that in the context of benefiting the communities that have disproportionately borne the burden of our really unsustainable transportation system. So what policies can Labour be pursuing that really gets at helping disadvantaged communities?
Well, I believe that what labor should do, labor should be at the table because affordable housing is a cliche and a catchword that doesn't really speak to where people are in Oakland, California. Affordable housing, the formula for affordable housing, and transit communities that are near public transit are not where most of us can afford to live. If most of us live within 20 miles of where we work, we're lucky. And so therefore, I believe one policy should be to tear apart the formula for affordable housing and take a real deep look at it and really rework it where affordable housing is affordable. And that's one way that could help not only disadvantaged communities, but our children who are coming out of college with all of this debt who can't afford to live anywhere near these quote unquote affordable housing areas. We need housing for teachers. We need housing for transit operators. We need housing for people who can afford to live in the area that they work in. And so the whole concept of affordable housing is a misnomer as far as I'm concerned, and a great policy would be to take another look at what affordable really is in any community that you live in and not paint it with a broad brush and everybody saying affordable housing when they know dang well there's no housing affordable in the area. So that would help our community greatly.
I would just simply say all of the public policies that are providing resources to communities. I believe it was Jeff who spoke about the Just Transition Fund and the ballot measure that disadvantaged communities, communities of color, who have often been experienced the greatest challenge and the greatest barriers as a result of climate change and other host of other issues, should be prioritized and should receive a greater portion of the investment. We have the challenge in Los Angeles when we sort of mapped out what the transit system would look like, and there was a fight over what should go first. Should the line that connects downtown Los Angeles to the water through the west side through to Santa Monica, which is obviously a much more affluent part of the city, should that be prioritized over a line that would go through the South LA working class community of color? And so there was a large debate over that when there really shouldn't have been a debate. I think that especially on the ballot measure side, if you can ensure that you are making clear as to what communities should be prioritized or what types of communities should be prioritized, that's a critical issue to pass by the vote of the people versus creating some parameters and then allowing legislators and elected officials, all due respect to many of our friends that are elected officials, but it's important that the people have a voice in saying where those dollars should be floated to, not just in particular groups of workers, but also into specific communities.
I would say three very quickly. In many cities where there is no public transport, the demand has to be that public transport is provided and that public transport is recognized as an essential service just like other services. So it's unacceptable that there are still cities where the majority of people are walking or having to make use of informal passenger services. Secondly, I think when private operations of public transport come up for renegotiation of the contracts, that there's a demand for those services to be brought under public ownership. That is happening in the UK at the moment around the rail services. It's happening in Korea at the moment in Metro, and there are a number of other examples that it's only under some kind of government, or whether that be national or local ownership, that we can have any control over how public transport operates. And I think thirdly is how we use the knowledge and skills that workers themselves have to improve and expand public transport. So how do we sort of access that knowledge to feed into the kind of improvements that are needed for public transport systems?
All right, time for audience questions. If you have any more, please send them on down. Yeah.
Only easy questions.
I'll start with the hot topic at the moment. So, how do you all think that the state, or I guess to make it more broad, government agencies should regulate transportation network companies to ensure job quality?
I believe that the state and the cities should put in place the same regulations that public transit workers are required to meet. Training, 1, background checks, 2, regular drug screenings, 3. In addition to that, I think there should be a minimum wage standard that applies to TNC workers, and that would be a start. So,
I would say the biggest thing is to ensure that those drivers cannot be defined as independent contractors, that they have to be defined as employees, period.
And this is my own corollary to that question. How should TNCs work in conjunction in conjunction with public transit? Is there a role for TNCs in that space?
TNC companies should be required to pay their fair share. Pay their fair share in taxes, pay their fair share for payroll taxes, and that could happen. Another way that TNCs can work in conjunction with public transportation is that if the workers are working under the same collective bargaining agreement as the public transportation workers, therefore offering them equity in their work.
What she said.
All right. I feel like here's a good one. So how can smaller cities increase transit and help facilitate transportation to and from rural areas? So we've been talking in kind of heavily urban contexts. How does that translate for smaller cities and places where they have to travel longer distances?
Well, I can speak to the smaller city concept, which, you have the city of LA, but then you have 87 other cities within the county of Los Angeles, and then, so we have 88 cities in the county of Los Angeles. 10% falls under the county, so you have 89 jurisdictions that ultimately regulate land use and, transit policy. You do have the MTA, Metro, which obviously has regionalized transportation. This isn't your question, but I actually argue that we need a metro for housing in Southern California, just because the issue is so big and such a problem. But to the small city, at least in Southern California, it really is, you have to partner with other small cities around you. I'm probably not the best person to speak to small cities in a rural context, so I'll leave that to someone else.
I don't know.
All right. And another one, given the connections between land use, transportation, and jobs, is the labor community organizing to get worker housing located near employment centers as a required benefit, or is that too unrealistic a goal?
I thought you said only easy questions.
Yeah, I think there has been some conversations over the past probably decade or so about that in Los Angeles. I know that recently there was some conversations about the LA Unified School District constructing housing on some of the parcels of land that it owns to construct housing specifically designed for teachers, which gets to that sort of donut hole of income level where rent is not really affordable, but there's really nothing out there for them. And you, in particular, I know LAUSD has talked about this. I know the city of Los Angeles has talked about it. The county of Los Angeles has talked about it. But it hasn't gotten off the ground, frankly, because I think everyone has been, those agencies have been wary about jumping into the housing conversation, just because it is obviously a little complicated, and they got a couple issues on their hand as it is.
There are some city government folks, and I won't call them by their names, but I'll speak to the city of Oakland, that's talking about using public land in order to build homes for many of our residents. I suppose they're residents because they really don't have a home because they live in tents and under bridges and under skyways here in the Bay Area. But there is some talk about what's the best use of public land. And as you said earlier, Rusty, if developers are coming in and they're buying the public parcels, then there should be some community benefits attached to that. If the community benefits are housing for teachers or whomever needs to live in the area, then that should be demanded. If it's benefits for our homeless population that are primarily, everyone that's homeless is not homeless because they're on drugs. A lot of them are homeless because they've been kicked out of their houses as the cost of housing has rose in the Bay Area. So whatever the community benefits are, whatever that process is, then the city governments should be making sure that those public lands that's supported by public dollars are for the good of the public. So that's what I think should be done. And there is some talk about it.
I will say that I know that on-site housing can have obviously a huge benefit. I had the opportunity to tour the BYD facility in China, which we have a BYD facility in LA County. And at their headquarters, they have 35,000, obviously China does everything big, but there are 35,000 workers at their headquarters, and they have nearly 10,000 units of housing right there on site at their headquarters. And it's a remarkable thing to see. Obviously, I don't know if we're going to have a campus with 35,000 workers on it, but I do think the concept is one that has a lot of potential. Sure.
Just wanted to answer that at a kind of wider policy level. We've got a kind of approach to transport based on a reduced shift, improve kind of model. So the shift is obviously the modal shift from private cars to public transport, but that's not sufficient to either reduce emissions or to gain any of the other benefits. You also have to focus on reducing the need to travel, both people and goods. So it's really important that question about how sort of things are relocalized, both in terms of production as well as where people are living, so you reduce the need to travel.
And we've got 4 minutes left, so last call for audience questions. No hands? All right, we have one gentleman in the back. Do you have a mic?
Sort of at the next level, is there anything going on or being thought about from a land use perspective of asking cities and localities to actually do other prioritization of land use, such as the actual streets themselves or parking or other things that will actually, I don't want to say drive people to mass transit, but incentivize that over cars and other things that are being
and allow me to paraphrase so I capture that on the mic. So, tell me if this is right, but essentially, how are cities reconfiguring their right-of-way, and are there policies in place that we've seen where cities are reconfiguring their rights-of-way to encourage public transit use and discourage single occupancy vehicle trips?
That's not what he said. Just kidding. That's a different question. I don't know of those policies. I do know that, at least on the and I keep going back to the housing conversation because it is so connected, at least in Los Angeles. You know, the big challenge we have in LA is that you have smaller jurisdictions that are essentially refusing to hold up their end of the bargain around the construction of housing or transit modifications or trying to push. You know, we have a big fight of the 710 that doesn't go all the way through to the 210, which causes a huge impact to one community and lets another community, a wider, more affluent community, off the hook, who is, by the way, also not building the housing that they should. And so there are some cases where, you know, I advocated earlier in this conversation, advocated for a local ballot approach versus a statewide legislative approach. We have begun to say to many of the smaller communities that are not holding up their end of the bargain, either on the transit side or the housing side, is that you're essentially going to force the hand of the coalition that helped get the resources to be able to do this, which is to go to the state and to essentially call your bluff, to pass legislation that forces you to do the right thing and to do it in the right way. And so I think, you know, it's a little bit of a challenge of whack-a-mole in Los Angeles because there's so many pieces that are popping up and fights that are popping up all the time. But ultimately, there has to be a regional solution to both of those challenges, and can't necessarily be handled on just a localized basis, especially in the case where local municipalities are not stepping forward and doing the right thing in the way in which they should.
And I think
Well, it
that's-
doesn't take much to let you guys know about BRT, right? BRT is taking so many parking spaces between 20th downtown and Hagenberger on the east side of Oakland. And hopefully, the result will be that more people will use that mode of transportation because there will be less spaces to park. So in order for many of the businesses to continue to be supported with the reduction in parking spaces, we're hopeful that the citizens will choose the BRT as their mode to get through that corridor more quickly and to also continue to support the local businesses.
Great. And that's time, folks. Thank you for joining us.